The town of Mayet Kaina, nestled in Burma, became the site of a profound historical revelation in August of 1944. After American forces fought through a grueling 78-day siege, finally bringing liberation to the region on August 10th, soldiers made a discovery that would forever change how the world understood Japanese military operations during the Second World War. Among those liberated were 20 Korean women and 2 Japanese civilian operators who had been running what the military would call comfort stations. What they found triggered a series of interrogations conducted by the U.S. Office of War Information's Psychological Warfare Unit, producing what would become officially known as Japanese Prisoner of War Interrogation Report Number 49. This single document represented the first official American record of what historians would eventually recognize as one of the most systematic programs of sexual slavery in the modern age. The women shared their stories with interrogators, accounts that painted a picture of calculated deception and systematic exploitation. They had been recruited back in Korea during 1942, promised good factory work in Singapore with decent wages and living conditions. Instead of factories, they found themselves transported through Rangoon and eventually pushed toward the Burmese frontier as part of a much larger operation designed to provide sexual services to Japanese military personnel. The report, which remained classified until its declassification in 1973, contained detailed descriptions of their living arrangements, how these stations operated day to day, and the calculated system behind what the Japanese military called comfort facilities. The scope of what Allied forces were uncovering across the entire Pacific theater challenged the very limits of comprehension for military personnel encountering it firsthand. Decades later, historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki would conduct extensive research revealing the true scale of this machinery of exploitation. Nearly 2,000 comfort stations had been scattered across territories stretching from China all the way through to the Dutch East Indies, and within those stations, approximately 200,000 women had been trapped in sexual servitude. Whether in the jungles of Burma, the rubble-filled streets of Manila, the mountain regions of China, or across the islands of the Dutch East Indies, soldiers from Allied nations were encountering survivors of organized sexual slavery operating at an industrial scale. Less than a month after the discoveries at Mayet Kaina, another crucial piece of historical documentation emerged. On September 7, 1944, US and Chinese Allied forces, working together, launched an assault on Japanese positions near Songshan in Yunnan Province, in the mountains of China. When they liberated Korean comfort women held at that location, Private Charles H. Hatfield, a photographer with the U.S. Army's 164th Signal Photo Company, captured an image that would become one of the most significant photographs in documenting the liberation of these enslaved women. The photograph showed 4 Korean women, one of them visibly pregnant, being guided towards safety by Chinese soldiers. Sergeant Edward Fay filmed moving pictures of that same liberation event. These images, preserved in the U.S. National Archives and protected for future generations, provided hard visual evidence that would prove enormously important decades into the future when survivors finally had the courage and opportunity to tell their stories. The pregnant woman visible in that historic photograph would not be publicly identified until much later, when she revealed herself as Park Young-sim. It would take 56 years, not until the year 2000, before she could finally speak openly about her ordeal during the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal held in Tokyo. According to military records documenting the original group of 24 comfort women present at Songshan, only 10 would make it through to the moment of liberation. 14 of those women had been killed during the intense bombardments that preceded the Allied assault on the position. The organization called the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, known as 8IS, played a pivotal role in documenting and understanding what had been discovered. Established back on September 19, 1942, operating under the command of Colonel Sidney F. Mashbeer, 8IS became the principal intelligence agency responsible for recording information about the Comfort Women system and capturing the extensive paper trail left behind by Japanese operations. By the time the war reached its final year in 1945, 8IS had expanded to include nearly 4,000 personnel. the majority of them Nisei Japanese Americans who possessed language skills essential for the massive undertaking. These translators and analysts processed thousands upon thousands of captured documents, papers that exposed the administrative machinery underlying the entire system of sexual slavery. One particularly important piece of research generated by ATS was Research Report number 120, officially titled Amenities in the Japanese Armed Forces. This report went directly to General MacArthur and represented perhaps the most thorough Allied documentation of the system that had been compiled. The version released on November 15, 1945, had grown substantially to 42 pages, expanding considerably from an earlier edition completed on February 22. Attached to this comprehensive report were captured Japanese military regulations showing how the system operated. These documents, now filed away in U.S. National Archives record groups 165, 331, 407, and 554, initially categorized comfort stations under headings like amusements and brothels rather than as war crimes, reflecting the limited understanding of the situation at that specific moment in history, a classification that would take many years to fundamentally change. The regulations that American soldiers had captured told a story of standardization and control. Military documents from the Huayue Liu Comfort Station in Nanjing, dated March 6, 1939, spelled out detailed procedures for medical examination schedules, fee structures that varied depending on military rank, specific operating hours, and mandatory requirements for prophylactic protection. The garrison headquarters in Mandalay had issued 30 separate items of regulation governing every aspect of operations, officially designating the women as licensed prostitutes while simultaneously maintaining strict military authority and oversight over their activities. The military transport paperwork revealed how the entire logistics of the operation functioned. Army cargo vessels transported comfort women from Japan and Korea across the Pacific, with each shipment requiring official permission from Japan's Ministry of War. When women traveled by rail, they were moved in freight cars labeled and documented as military supplies. Every single movement of these women required multiple approvals to be obtained. Forms had to be prepared in triplicate, and official seals and stamps had to be affixed. This elaborate bureaucratic machinery, ironically, meant that physical evidence of the system survived and could be recovered even after other documents had been destroyed or deliberately burned. The written language found in all these documents had been carefully constructed to obscure what was actually happening. When documents referred to special service personnel, they meant women being held as sex slaves. When they wrote comfort facilities, they were describing rape stations. When military doctors recorded medical treatment in their records, they often actually meant forced abortion procedures. The term amenities applied to systematic rape was classified as entertainment. This deliberate linguistic sanitization of reality would have profound consequences later on, affecting how comfort women were categorized and treated during and after liberation. Many fell through the cracks of military bureaucratic systems, fitting none of the official categories of prisoners of war, civilian internees, or military personnel, leaving their status profoundly ambiguous. The liberation of the Philippine archipelago, which took place from October 1944 through July 1945, exposed the most extensive network of comfort station operations that American forces would encounter anywhere in the entire Pacific Theater. When the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division rolled into Manila on February 3, 1945, pushing hard to reach Santo Tomas University, where 3,785 Allied civilians had been imprisoned for years, soldiers moved through neighborhoods where comfort stations had been maintaining operations for the preceding 3 years. Records maintained by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, would eventually document 12 distinct comfort stations within Manila itself, along with 5 additional brothel operations. Beyond the capital city, additional facilities were discovered scattered across the islands. In North Luzon, Americans discovered Bayon Bon, which had held between 12 and 16 women. Moving through central Visayas, they found Musbate. On Panay Island, Iloilo contained similar operations. At Tacloban on Leyte, a station called Sabu had housed 9 Filipino women. Burawan also operated on Leyte, while Butuan on Mindanao had held 3 Filipino women. The island of Mindanao contained multiple stations, including Cagayan, with 3 separate locations, and Davao with women of mixed nationalities. The scale of operations throughout the archipelago testified to how thoroughly the Japanese military had developed this system across occupied territories. The American 37th Infantry Division fought through brutal urban combat that lasted throughout the month-long battle for Manila, an engagement that didn't conclude until March 3, 1945. The 148th Infantry Regiment specifically liberated both the Philippine General Hospital and the University of the Philippines on February 17, 1945, freeing 7,000 civilian captives in that action alone. As these operations unfolded across the devastated city, American forces systematically stumbled upon comfort stations scattered through the Ermita, Malate, Binondo, and Quiapo districts. The soldiers documented what they found and recorded their discoveries for intelligence purposes. Financial records that American forces captured at Japanese 14th Area Army headquarters revealed the economic machinery operating beneath the entire system. Women were charged for every necessity of survival, their food costs, their clothing, medical services, with charges that consistently exceeded what they could possibly earn, creating a permanent state of debt slavery. The military paymaster sections controlled all financial transactions, meaning women never held actual money or had any meaningful economic autonomy. Payment vouchers from these records showed that soldiers paid according to their rank, with privates paying 2 yen, non-commissioned officers paying 3 yen, while officers received special arrangements that often provided them greater access or reduced costs. Among those women liberated in the Philippines was Maria Rosa L. Henson, born on December 5, 1927. Her rescue, though it occurred while American liberation operations were underway, actually came through Filipino guerrilla fighters who were working alongside American forces against the Japanese. In February of 1942, at merely 14 years old, she had suffered her first sexual assault by Japanese soldiers occupying the islands. By April of 1943, Japanese military personnel had forced her into comfort woman service, where she remained trapped for 9 long months. Filipino guerrillas managed to rescue her in January of 1944, while American forces were making final preparations for their return to the Philippines. Henson would carry the weight of her experience forward through the decades. In 1992, she became the first Philippine woman to speak publicly about what had happened to her, breaking nearly 50 years of imposed silence. Her courageous decision to come forward meant that others felt emboldened to tell their own stories. She later became one of the first recipients of assistance through the Asian Women's Fund project in 1996. Her testimony provided irreplaceable documentation of how comfort stations actually functioned within the Philippines and demonstrated the significant role that Filipino resistance fighters played in liberation operations. Nothing that military planners and intelligence officers anticipated could have adequately prepared American forces for what awaited them on Okinawa when the invasion commenced on April 1, 1945. Intelligence estimates had suggested that perhaps several comfort stations might exist on the island. When soldiers actually arrived, they discovered a reality that far exceeded even the most pessimistic projections. Over 145 separate comfort stations operated across an island measuring merely 70 miles in length, according to careful historical documentation compiled after the war. During the Okinawa campaign, which involved the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions among numerous other units, military personnel discovered comfort stations in virtually every major town and at every significant military installation scattered across the island. In Nahar alone, military intelligence reported finding 17 former comfort stations, each one telling a story of systematic abuse. The women discovered in these facilities included Koreans, Taiwanese, and Okinawans. Military records documented their ages, and the numbers made clear the callousness of the system, with some of the women documented as being merely 14 years old. The rapid collapse of Japanese defensive lines in certain sectors led to discoveries that shocked even hardened combat soldiers. Near Shuri, the ancient capital city of Okinawa, Marines from the 1st Division pushed into cave complexes where Japanese forces had hidden Korean comfort women from advancing American troops. According to military reports compiled at the time, these women had been subjected to relentless propaganda. told that American soldiers would torture them, that they would face unspeakable cruelty if captured, horrific tales designed to terrify them into surrender or suicide rather than liberation. Some women had actually been given hand grenades and explicitly instructed to end their own lives rather than allow themselves to be taken prisoner. The sheer volume of documentation that needed to be processed on Okinawa overwhelmed the available translator personnel working for the military. By May of 1945, ATIS had deployed 3 full translation teams to the island, working constantly to process the thousands upon thousands of documents related to comfort station operations and administration. The bureaucratic detail was staggering in its precision and scope. Duty rosters detailed the reality of women forced to service 30 to 40 soldiers per single day during peak periods of operation. Medical records contained documentation of forced abortions performed on women who became pregnant from rape. Sterilization procedures were recorded in clinical language that masked the violence of what had been inflicted. Payment ledgers demonstrated the military's absolute financial control over every single aspect of the system. The Military Intelligence Service, known as MIS, comprised primarily of Nisei Japanese Americans, contributed crucially to documenting what had been discovered about comfort women. Merrill's Marauders, officially designated as the 5307 Composite Unit Provisional and commanded by Brigadier General Frank D. Merrill, had operated behind enemy lines throughout Burma during 1944, with a team of 14 Japanese-American MIS translators who were absolutely essential for interrogating captured comfort station personnel. After Merrill's Marauders disbanded on August 10, 1944, the Mars Task Force under Brigadier General John P. Willey took over successor operations. This unit, which included the 475th Infantry Regiment and the 124th Cavalry Regiment, maintained teams of 12 Nisei language specialists trained to continue liberation operations throughout northern Burma. These translators confronted unprecedented challenges in their work. The women they encountered spoke Korean, Chinese, Tagalog, Indonesian, Dutch, and numerous regional dialects that complicated communication across language barriers. Many of the Korean women had been prevented from speaking their native language for so long that they had difficulty communicating even with translators who themselves spoke Korean. Beyond language obstacles, cultural barriers made discussion of sexual trauma almost unbearably difficult, with many women refusing to speak at all with male translators, a reluctance that made documentation of their experiences considerably harder to accomplish. The documents that translators processed revealed how the system operated with a clear racial hierarchy baked into its structure. Korean women were classified as Category A. Chinese women fell into Category B. Southeast Asian women were placed in the lower Category C. Different stations served different military ranks, with some facilities designated exclusively for officers, facilities where fewer women faced even more extreme and systematic abuse. The documentation showed how rape had been industrialized according to military hierarchy and racial prejudice, a systematic dehumanization that operated according to explicit military policy and categorization. The liberation of the Dutch East Indies, coinciding with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, revealed another dimension to this larger horror: the enslavement of European women within the system. Among them was Jan Ruff O'Hearn, who had been born in Java in 1923 and remained living there through the Japanese occupation. She had been forced into a military brothel in 1944 at the age of 21. In February of 1944, O'Hearn had been taken from the Ambarawa internment camp along with 9 other Dutch women. They had all been held at a comfort station located in Semarang for 4 consecutive months before being relocated to a camp at Batavia, where they finally experienced liberation on August 15, 1945. O'Hearn would eventually break decades of silence surrounding her experience, publishing her memoir 50 years later in 1994, a book titled 50 Years of Silence, which provided her detailed personal account of what she endured. She later testified at a U.S. congressional hearing in 2007, providing extensive documentation of the systematic nature of Japanese military sexual slavery. Her testimony provided American lawmakers with direct first-person evidence of the machinery that had been constructed to exploit vulnerable women during wartime. British and Australian forces taking control from the Japanese in certain regions, documented their own discoveries of comfort stations throughout Java. Australian naval personnel became specifically involved in the repatriation efforts, helping to move Indonesian comfort women from Labuan in Borneo to safer locations. The Boagor camp in West Java had been established with the explicit purpose of housing women who had been forced into military brothels. Batavia camps became the processing centers where 10,500 women and children moved through in the post-liberation period, receiving initial assistance and preparation for eventual repatriation. The Dutch military authorities, returning to reclaim their colonial territories, initially decided to suppress information about comfort stations involving Dutch women. Official records were sealed, a decision justified by protecting women's honor and reputation. This approach, though intended to shield survivors from social stigma, actually delayed justice and public recognition of their suffering for many decades into the future. The decision would have profound consequences for how these Dutch women were treated and remembered. When Allied medical teams examined liberated comfort women, they documented consequences that were catastrophic in their severity. According to the U.S. Office of War Information Report number 49, the physical examinations performed on the women revealed malnutrition comparable to other prisoners of war who had experienced massive weight loss, averaging 32% of their normal body weight. Sexually transmitted diseases appeared almost universally among the women. Military medical reports documented alarming rates of syphilis and gonorrhea, conditions that had often received inadequate treatment with toxic substances, including something called salva-sun and arsamine, compounds that caused permanent sterility and other grave complications. The medical documentation revealed evidence of forced abortion procedures, sterilization surgeries, and catastrophic reproductive damage resulting from repeated sexual assault. The records showed the systematic brutality embedded within the system. Women presented weighing merely 60 to 70 pounds, when their normal body weight should have been between 100 and 120 pounds. Diseases stemming from severe nutritional deficiency appeared regularly. Conditions like scurvy, beriberi, pellagra, and kwashiorkor, the same diseases typically seen in concentration camps. Military medical personnel provided initial treatment using newly available sulfur-based drugs and penicillin, representing a significant advancement over whatever inadequate care had been possible during the war years. However, specialized psychological support addressing sexual trauma remained virtually non-existent given the limited state of psychiatric understanding in the 1940s. Military doctors recorded observations using the medical terminology available at that time, describing what they called hysteria, melancholia, and nervous exhaustion, clinical terms that fundamentally failed to capture what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Medical personnel's signatures appeared on documents authorizing forced abortion procedures. One document from a Philippine comfort station showed that 15 forced abortions had been performed within a single month. Sterilization procedures were documented at multiple locations across the theater. The medical records demonstrated that comfort women were viewed by the military not as patients deserving care and dignity, but as military equipment requiring maintenance and repair. The U.S. Army's 164th Signal Photo Company contributed crucial visual documentation extending well beyond their work at Songshan. Signal Corps photographers systematically documented liberated comfort stations across the Pacific Theater, capturing photographs of the small cubicles where women had been held, military-issue bedding in those cramped spaces, examination tables used for forced medical procedures, and boxes of military condoms stacked in storage areas. These clinical photographs, intended initially for intelligence purposes only, inadvertently created a visual archive of the systematic rape infrastructure that had been deliberately constructed. The images, classified and restricted for many decades, showed how standardized comfort stations had been across all locations. Whether in the Philippines, Burma, or across Pacific Islands, the facilities followed consistent patterns, buildings that had been converted into small rooms barely large enough for a military cot, communal washing facilities, and separate medical examination areas. The military precision evident in the physical layout appeared in every photograph. The photographers documented not only the physical facilities, but also the women themselves at the moment of liberation. Their images captured severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, and the haunted expressions of people who had endured profound trauma. These photographs, taken while attempting to preserve the women's dignity as much as possible, given the circumstances, provided irrefutable visual evidence of systematic abuse on an enormous scale. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, known as UNRWA, established in November of 1943, managed the enormous repatriation effort involving millions of displaced persons. By 1946, UNRWA had grown to employ 11,000 staff members, managing hundreds of displaced persons camps spread across all the territories that had been under Japanese control. Between the months of May and June of 1945 alone, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, repatriated 5.25 million displaced persons, moving them at an astounding rate of 80,000 per day. However, comfort women were processed alongside general civilian populations without receiving specialized care or attention to their unique trauma. Their ambiguous bureaucratic status, fitting into none of the official categories of prisoners of war, civilian internees, or military personnel, affected everything from the quality of medical care they received to their priority for transportation and assistance. This bureaucratic limbo meant that many women received only minimal assistance despite their overwhelming trauma and urgent medical needs. Some women found themselves unable or psychologically unwilling to return home. The research documents specific individuals and their particular struggles. One woman remained in Okinawa after liberation, classified as a stateless Korean under U.S. military rule, later becoming classified as an illegal alien when Okinawa returned to Japanese control in 1972. Korean women trapped in China had lost fluency in their native language over decades of forced isolation and abuse. Some married local men for protection and basic survival. The American Red Cross, operating at its peak with 7.5 million volunteers and 39,000 paid staff in 1945, provided comfort items and non-medical support through volunteer programs including the Grey Ladies, who offered basic psychological first aid to displaced persons passing through processing centers. However, language barriers and profound cultural differences limited the effectiveness of these efforts. The system remained fundamentally focused on rapid repatriation rather than addressing the deep trauma that these women carried. Through Confucian traditions, family honor rested entirely on female virtue. Daughters who survived rape carried unbearable stigma. Not just personal shame, but dishonor reflected onto everyone who shared their blood. Many families chose silence and denial over acknowledgement, preferring to mourn daughters they believed dead rather than face the social ruin of admitting what had truly happened to them. The Catholic Philippines faced comparable struggles with its own rigid moral framework. Women bearing the marks of sexual violence encountered rejection from their communities, cast out as damaged goods. In Dionysian Muslim societies, the concept of forced defilement created similar impossible situations. Women caught between survival and social death. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East's treatment of comfort, women stands as a stark reminder of how post-war justice systems could fail those who needed protection most. The tribunal operated for nearly 2.5 years, from April 1946 through November 1948. Testimony poured in from 419 witnesses. Evidence accumulated, 4,336 exhibits in total. Yet when the judgment finally came down, the official record contained just a single direct reference to forced prostitution. That solitary mention focused on Kuala Lumpur in China, where Japanese military recruiters had promised factory work to women, then forced them into sexual slavery instead. The real legal breakthrough emerged elsewhere entirely. The Dutch Batavia Temporary Court-Martial pursued a different path. Between August 1946 and December 1949, this tribunal examined 171 cases. 4 of them specifically addressed forced prostitution. These Dutch proceedings would establish crucial legal ground that the Far East Tribunal had largely abandoned. The Semarang incident verdict arrived on February 14, 1948. An army major named Okada faced execution for his role in forcing approximately 35 Dutch women from concentration camps into comfort stations. 11 others received sentences ranging from 2 to 20 years. Years later, in April 2007, researchers uncovered 7 official documents in the Tokyo trial's archives that investigators had possessed but never prosecuted. These papers proved the Tokutai, Japan's naval military police, had systematically forced women into frontline brothels across China, Indochina, and Indonesia. The evidence had sat untouched for 6 decades. The failure to pursue these charges sent a devastating message through survivors' lives. Sexual slavery apparently didn't warrant serious prosecution. Justice seemed not to apply to rape. This decision echoed through 4.5 decades of silence. From 1945 onward, comfort women kept their pain buried. Everything changed on August 14, 1991. Kim Hakson stepped forward publicly to acknowledge her past. She became the first woman to openly identify herself as a former comfort woman. Her press conference cracked open a door that had remained sealed. Across Asia, other survivors found courage to speak. What had been whispered in shame suddenly demanded attention. Documentary evidence gathered by American forces decades earlier suddenly gained credibility through these living testimonies. In January 1992, historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki made a discovery that would reshape everything. At Japan's defense agency, National Institute of Defense Studies Archives, he found documents that proved direct Japanese military involvement. These weren't the actions of rogue commanders, they were official policy. Military orders established comfort stations. Regulations documented direct military control and supervision throughout the system. The Shanghai Expeditionary Force Diary from 1932 contained an entry by senior staff officer Okabe Naosaburo, describing the very first comfort station created during the Shanghai incident. These discoveries validated what survivors had insisted all along. The military had organized this system deliberately. It wasn't chaos or individual excess. It was systematic, controlled, and bureaucratically managed from the highest levels. Following Kim Hakson's breakthrough, other women began telling their stories. Yong-Soo Lee testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Relations Committee in 2007. She had been taken as a teenager from Daegu, Korea, stolen from her life without choice. Her voice, joined with 2 other survivors, helped push through U.S. House Resolution 121, a formal statement urging Japan to accept full responsibility for the comfort women system. Park Young-sim finally put her name and story to one of World War II's most haunting photographs. That famous image from Songshan showed a pregnant woman, her, at 17 years old, about to endure 3 years of sexual slavery. In 2000, she testified at the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo. Later, she visited the Nanjing Lijixiang Comfort Station site, the place where she had been held before transfer to Songshan. She stood in those spaces where her youth had been stolen. Il-chul Kang had been forcibly taken to China in 1943. She never returned home after the war ended. Instead, she remained in China working as a nurse until 2000, her displacement lasting 55 years. When she finally traveled to the United States, she spoke repeatedly about her experience. Her painting titled Girls Being Burnt became central to the feature film Spirit's Homecoming. Her life embodied the long-term devastation the comfort women system created, not just trauma during captivity, but displacement that shadowed her entire existence. The 1990s and 2000s opened archives worldwide. American military collections released declassified photographs showing comfort stations scattered across the Pacific Theater. Medical reports detailed the systematic abuse methodically inflicted. Intelligence documents revealed military infrastructure deliberately built to facilitate sexual slavery. Between 2014 and 2015, Chinese archives released over 90 documents from Kwantung Army Military Police Corps records stored in Jilin. These papers provided something undeniable, evidence that the Japanese military funded the entire operation. Bank records from puppet regime financial institutions in Manchuria documented payments for what they euphemistically called special personnel procurement. Professor Su Jiliang's research revealed the staggering scope. Approximately 200,000 Chinese women alone forced into comfort stations. Chinese women comprised 36% of all comfort women across the entire system. The geographic reach demonstrated the system's unprecedented scale. Stations stretched from Japan itself across China to the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Burma, New Guinea, Hong Kong, Macau, French Indochina, Korea, and Taiwan. The system had tentacles everywhere the Japanese military operated. The demographic breakdown exposed the deliberate racial hierarchy embedded in the system. 51.8% were Korean, 36% were Chinese. Japanese women made up 12.2%. The remaining percentage included Filipino, Taiwanese, Indonesian, Burmese, Dutch, and Australian women. Each nationality occupied a specific place in this hierarchy of exploitation. The military organization revealed systematic coordination at every level. High Command issued establishment orders. Regional staff officers created detailed operational plans. Local military police supervised daily operations. Military doctors conducted regular examinations. Medical infrastructure dedicated to managing sexual slavery. Among the most chilling discoveries came from the very end of the war. Disposal orders. These documents emerged at multiple locations. As Allied forces approached, Japanese military commanders issued orders for what they termed special disposal of comfort women. The purpose was explicit: prevent their capture and testimony. Multiple massacre sites discovered in the Philippines and elsewhere proved these orders weren't theoretical. They were carried out systematically. On November 23, 1944, Japanese forces at Mapaniki village in the Philippines attempted to eliminate comfort women before American soldiers arrived. Similar incidents unfolded across the Pacific as Japanese forces retreated. The high mortality rate among comfort women, historians estimate 75%, reflected not just brutal conditions but deliberate killing. The Japanese military recognized that survivors would become witnesses to war crimes. They tried to eliminate that evidence by eliminating the women themselves. These disposal orders represented something profound: Japanese military consciousness of guilt. The lengths to which they would go to prevent exposure revealed they understood the magnitude of their crimes. They weren't trying to hide military secrets, they were trying to destroy human witnesses to atrocity. Japanese propaganda had weaponized women's fear for propaganda purposes. During captivity, women were told repeatedly that Americans would torture them, that Americans would cannibalize them. British accounts from Burma documented Korean comfort, women's astonishment when they learned the British possessed no intention of eating them. This manufactured terror served dual purposes during the war. It discouraged escape attempts while captive. It encouraged suicide rather than capture. Multiple reports documented women being handed grenades with explicit instructions to kill themselves rather than be taken by Americans. This psychological warfare didn't end with Japanese surrender. It continued affecting women's minds long after physical liberation. The effectiveness of this propaganda became visible during liberation operations across the Pacific. Women hid from liberating forces. They attempted suicide. Some remained in abandoned comfort stations even after Japanese forces fled. The psychological conditioning ran so deep that many women couldn't initially believe that Allied forces intended rescue rather than harm. The cognitive dissonance was too profound. Everything they'd been told contradicted what was actually happening. As occupation forces spread across Japan in late 1945, they uncovered something shocking. The comfort women system had operated within Japan itself. Comfort stations serving training bases and military installations operated on Japanese soil. But something even more disturbing emerged. Japanese authorities had prepared similar facilities for occupation forces. Before American soldiers arrived, the Recreation and Amusement Association had been established and was recruiting thousands of Japanese women as special entertainers. General MacArthur immediately banned the arrangement. His decision reflected both moral objections and public health concerns, though enforcement remained inconsistent in practice. Navy documentation revealed the Japanese military had maintained meticulous statistics on comfort women throughout the entire war. These files, quickly classified by occupation authorities, exposed the staggering scale of the system. The bureaucratic precision was stunning. Registration forms, medical inspection schedules, financial records, Sexual slavery had been integrated into military operations with the same administrative attention given to ammunition supply or fuel distribution. Every aspect had been quantified, recorded, and filed. One significant gap mars the historical record. Very few detailed accounts exist from American soldiers who actually liberated comfort women. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project, the National World War II Museum collections, military historical archives, all reveal minimal documentation from liberating troops' perspectives. Several factors explain this absence. Japanese military records had been systematically destroyed at war's end. The comfort women issue remained taboo for decades after 1945. Military documentation prioritized tactical operations over social encounters. Many comfort women died during the war itself, or were killed by retreating Japanese forces before liberation could reach them. American military personnel themselves seemed rendered silent by the shocking nature of what they encountered. There was no institutional framework for understanding systematic sexual slavery. The military possessed protocols for liberating prisoners of war and civilian internees. Nothing existed for handling victims of organized rape. This institutional gap contributed directly to the invisibility that would shroud comfort women's experiences for decades. From 1945 through 1991, comfort women remained history's hidden victims. Government compensation flowed to recognized POWs and civilian internees. Comfort women, unclassified and unacknowledged, received nothing. The silence was maintained by everyone involved. Japanese government officials destroyed records and denied responsibility. Allied governments classified documents and avoided embarrassing questions. Asian governments prioritized economic development over advocacy for their own victimized citizens. The breakthrough came through survivors' courage alone. Following Kim Hakson's testimony in 1991, the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal in 2000 finally provided a forum. 64 survivors from 8 countries provided formal legal testimony. The tribunal lacked legal authority, yet it created something invaluable, a comprehensive record validating decades of hidden suffering. U.S. House Resolution 121 passed in 2007, officially recognizing comfort women's suffering. It urged Japan to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept historical responsibility in a manner that was unequivocal and clear. This recognition arrived 62 years after liberation, a measure of how long the journey from rescue to acknowledgement truly required. Modern retrospective studies of comfort women survivors document something deeply troubling. 90% show lifetime prevalence of PTSD. 65% still show current symptoms decades later. These rates far exceed Holocaust survivors, where prevalence stands at 39%. These statistics validate the severe psychological trauma that military medical personnel in 1945 had documented but poorly understood. The systematic nature of the comfort women's system becomes evident in examining its scope. Operations spanned from 1932 to 1945 across territories encompassing the entire Japanese Empire. Standardized regulations were replicated across thousands of facilities. Military logistics involved transportation networks, medical services, and financial management. Racial hierarchies were deliberately embedded into operational procedures. The numbers tell a story of industrial-scale sexual slavery implemented with military precision and bureaucratic efficiency. The very comprehensiveness of the system, its documentation, standardization, and scale, became the evidence that would eventually overcome decades of denial. Military translator reports survived, Signal Corps photographs survived, medical records survived, intelligence documents survived. An archive was created that couldn't be entirely eliminated. When survivors finally spoke, their testimonies matched records buried in classified files, providing verification that transformed hidden history into acknowledged truth. Every captured regulation contributed to the case. Every photographed comfort station added evidence. Every translated document built the record further. The bureaucratic precision that Japanese military applied to sexual slavery became proof of systematic war crimes. The very documents meant to organize exploitation became evidence of atrocity. American soldiers who discovered comfort stations probably never imagined their routine documentation would become crucial historical evidence in a decades-long fight for truth. Their photographs, reports, and translations created an archive that survived attempts at denial and forgetting. What seemed like routine military documentation became evidence that demands acknowledgement. As of 2024, fewer than 20 Korean comfort women survivors remain alive. Their testimonies, validated by documentary evidence American forces created during liberation, stand as irrefutable proof of systematic war crimes. Comfort women statues now stand in cities worldwide as silent testimony to suffering long denied. The women discovered by American forces represented one of World War II's most extensive war crimes. The liberation these women experienced, documented in military reports and photographs and testimonies, provided evidence that took decades to acknowledge fully. The systematic nature, standardized regulations, military transportation, medical infrastructure, financial systems, all proved this was official policy, not battlefield excess. The failure to immediately recognize and address comfort women's experiences reflected multiple institutional failures. Military bureaucracy was unprepared for systematic sexual crimes. Cultural stigmas silenced victims. Political decisions prioritized stability over justice. Gender biases minimized sexual violence. These failures compounded original trauma, extending suffering decades beyond liberation. Yet the evidence endured. The photographs taken by Signal Corps units, the reports filed by intelligence officers, the medical records created by military doctors, all confirm what survivors insisted for decades. The liberation American forces provided between 1944 and 1945 began a process that continues today, with survivors still seeking full acknowledgement and official apology. The story offers profound lessons about war, trauma, and justice. Physical liberation doesn't automatically grant psychological freedom. Rescue without recognition perpetuates suffering. Documentation without prosecution enables denial. The American forces who encountered comfort women faced something beyond their training or comprehension. Yet their documentation created a historical record that would eventually support justice. The women American forces liberated from comfort stations couldn't believe liberation was real because their trauma ran deeper than physical captivity. They had been told repeatedly they were worthless, that death was preferable to their shame, that no one would ever accept them again. Liberation challenged these internalized beliefs, creating cognitive dissonance that many never fully resolved. The documentary evidence, from report number 49 to the Songshan photographs, to ATIS translations to Signal Corps images, provides irrefutable proof of systematic war crimes. The bureaucratic precision of Japanese military sexual slavery, captured in Allied intelligence files, cannot be denied. As the last survivors pass away, their testimonies become more precious, supported by every document, photograph, and report American forces created. The comfort women who couldn't believe in their liberation understood a profound truth. True freedom required not just removing captors, but rebuilding humanity. It required not just opening doors, but acknowledging what had happened behind them. It required not just surviving, but being believed. Their decades-long fight for recognition continues the liberation process American soldiers began 80 years ago. Today, the evidence is clear. The testimonies are confirmed. The systematic nature is proven. The journey from physical liberation to recognition represents one of history's longest fights for justice. A fight supported by the archive of truth American forces, created when they first encountered the unbelievable reality of Japan's comfort women system. Their initial disbelief at liberation reflected understanding that freedom from captivity was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward justice, recognition, and healing that continues to this day. The American soldiers who discovered these women documented one of history's largest systematic war crimes. In preserving evidence of atrocity, they performed a service beyond military duty. They bore witness to truth that demanded acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement would take decades to achieve. The comfort women's story challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about war, gender, and justice, reminding us that liberation is not a moment, but a process. One that for these women remains incomplete Even as their numbers dwindle and time runs out for full justice to be served,